Welcome to WhiskyCast, Ask Strength Conversation, featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 918 for January 24th, 2022. Coming up in a few minutes.
My wife and I were looking for ways that we could showcase the grains that we were growing. We knew that they're extremely high quality, but what can we do with them to showcase those? And my other love was always whiskey, and thought, what better way to showcase our grains and let other people experience it and, be able to meet interesting people and everything else than to make it into whiskey.
Colby Frey and his wife Ashley opened the Frey Ranch Distillery on their family's Nevada farm back in 2013. And they grow everything they use to make their whiskey. Well, except for the yeast. And maybe some of the ingredients for the cocktails in their tasting room. We'll take an audio tour of Frey Ranch with Colby Frey on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Your Voice, and on Behind the Label.
Got the chance right at the start to work in Springbank Distillery, making whiskey, which was amazing. Still use that knowledge to this day, actually.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
People always ask me, does Redbreast go better with ice or without? Would it go well with figs, dark chocolate, apple crumble? Is there one particular thing I should enjoy it with? I tell them, yeah, other people.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Well, the holidays have come and gone, and hopefully you had enough good whiskey to share with friends and family. If your whiskey shelf is looking a little thin, look no further than Dewar's Double Double 21 Year to add to the New Year's collection. Double-aged and finished in the finest Oloroso sherry casks, this one may not last. Find it at a store near you.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. Last time around, I reported on the ongoing stalemate between the U.S. and the U.K. governments over the American tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. Of course, the U.K.'s tariff on imports of American whiskies is a direct result of that dispute. Now the two sides have agreed to resume talks aimed at resolving the steel and aluminum issue. Those talks will be done behind closed doors, but we'll keep an eye out for news from Washington and London on a resolution. The UK's tariff has cut into exports of bourbon and other American whiskies to Great Britain by 53% since it was imposed in 2018. Despite the impact of the UK's tariff and the matching European Union tariff that was suspended at the start of the year, the bourbon industry continues to boom in Kentucky. The Kentucky Distillers Association released its latest economic impact study by Dr. Paul Coombs of the University of Louisville this past week. It shows distillers have a $9 billion economic impact each year in Kentucky and now account for more than 22,500 jobs statewide. Many of those jobs are high-paying ones, too. The average salary for whiskey industry workers is around $102,000 a year. That's the first time the average has exceeded $100,000 in the 12 years the KDA has been commissioning these studies. More economic impact stuff, this time out of Scotland, where the Glenmorangie company plans to make another massive investment in its production facilities. The Herald reports plans are in the works for a new maturation campus near the flagship Glenmorangie Distillery in Tain. 16 new warehouses will be built over the next 8 years. The company's bottling plant in Livingston is getting new equipment that will double bottling capacity as well. That follows last year's opening of the new still house at Ardbeg and the Lighthouse Experimental Distillery at Glenmorangie. In other news, Glendronach has released its oldest expression yet, a 50-year-old single malt distilled in 1971 and matured in a Pedro Jimenez sherry cask. Only 198 bottles will be available worldwide. The UK recommended retail price, £20,000 a bottle. Meanwhile, one of Scotland's newest distilleries is releasing its first single malt. Lochley Distillery in Ayrshire timed the release of its first 3-year-old single malt to coincide with Burns Night this Tuesday. Appropriate since Robert Burns lived at the farm where the distillery now sits. It goes on sale Tuesday in the UK for £50 a bottle. You can listen to my interview last month with Lochley production director John Campbell in episode 910 of WhiskyCast. It's in the archives at our website. Italy's Puny Distillery is releasing its oldest whiskey yet. Ora Limited Edition 2 is an 8-year-old cask-strength release that's matured in ex-Marsala wine casks. It'll be available starting next week for €160 a bottle through the distillery's website and selected whiskey shops. And Dublin's Teeling Whiskey Company is spreading out distribution of its award-winning 30-year-old Irish single malt. It was distilled in 1991 at Cooley and then spent its final 9 years in Sauterne wine casks. After first being available only within Ireland, it's now available in the U.S., Europe, Russia, and selected Asian markets. Only 4,000 bottles are available worldwide. And finally, years of collecting whiskies have paid off for an anonymous collector known only as Pat. He decided to sell off his collection of more than 9,000 bottles more than a year ago. After working with the online whiskey auctioneer site on 23 separate auctions, Pat's collection has finally been sold off. The final total, £3.36 million. That's around $4.6 million at current exchange rates. No word on how he plans to reinvest the profits, but if you're lucky enough to know Pat, he can probably afford to buy a round the next time you're with him at the pub. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com and on our social media timelines. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Join us each Friday at 5 p.m. New York time for our Happy Hour live webcasts on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel, our Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. In the coming weeks, my guests will include Maker's Mark Chairman Emeritus Bill Samuels Jr. on February 11th, along with Alexander Rossi and James Hinchcliffe from IndyCar, and the producer of their Off Track with Hinch and Rossi podcast, Tim Durham. They'll be making their annual guest appearance on February 4th. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. We have new dates now for a couple of this month's postponed events. The National Whiskey Festival in Glasgow, Scotland is now set for May 7th, while the Bergen Beer and Whiskey Festival in Norway will be held on May 6th and 7th. Between now and then, the Philly Chocolate, Wine, and Whiskey Festival is still on for this coming Saturday in Philadelphia. The Southport Winter Whiskey Festival is set for February 11th and 12th in Southport, England, along with Glasgow's Whiskey Festival, February 19th. Dramfest 2022 is set for the weekend of February 26th and 27th in Christchurch, New Zealand, and that same weekend is the Newcastle Whiskey Festival in Newcastle, England. The first weekend of March is a busy one with the Fife Whiskey Festival in Scotland, the Roma Whiskey Festival in Italy, Distill America in Madison, Wisconsin, and Whiskey Birmingham in England. Keep in mind, all in-person events are still subject to change on short notice, and you may have to show proof of vaccination or a recent negative COVID test, maybe even both, in order to attend. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. Catoctin Creek co-founder Scott Harris is leading his annual Art of the Cocktail class again this winter online, and the fun happens each Friday night. You can get all the details at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com, and Catoctin Creek reminds you to always drink responsibly.
There are 3 whiskeys in the Dewar's Double Double series to explore. Take, for example, our 21 year, an absolute must-try for any whiskey drinker. Our master blender puts this whiskey through a unique 4-stage aging process, a testament to the care and craftsmanship required to make such a fine whiskey. Aged for a minimum of 21 years, this Scotch whiskey is then double-aged and finished in first-fill Oloroso sherry casks. Dark red in color with fruit intertwined with honey on the palate, all packaged in a bottle that is sure to impress. Mark and the good folks of the WhiskyCast team awarded this whiskey an impressive 94-point rating along with an excellent tag when they tasted it back in 2019. Since then, Dewar's Double Double 21 year hasn't stopped racking up awards and accolades. Double Double 21 is a limited release offering from Dewar's, so you'll need to stay on the lookout. Also, keep an eye out for our Double Double 27 year finished in rare Palo Cortado casks and a 32 year finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, a whiskey that took home Whiskey of the Year at the 2020 International Whiskey Competition. Dewar's Double Double. It's a great way to kick off 2022.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Oban and the Classic Malts lineup. Farmers have been turning their grain into whiskey for centuries, and there was a time when so-called farm distilleries dominated the whiskey industry. Of course, that has changed over the last 150 years or so, but the growth of craft distilling means a whole new crop of farm distilleries. I had the chance to tour the Frey Ranch Distillery in Fallon, Nevada recently. Colby and Ashley Frey hosted a group of whiskey writers at the ranch, and Colby showed us around.
If you look right over, well, you can't see it, but our house is right over there. Ashley and I live right here in the middle of the farm. We're growing the crops right around it. The distillery's right here, so we're right in the center of everything, which is it's a blessing for us, but sometimes you can never get away from it, which is okay because we love it. But so this building was all designed by us. My dad's really good on AutoCAD, and he said, how tall do you want it? How wide do you want it? You know, what attributes? How do you want it to look? And so we designed it all ourselves. We did all of our own plumbing, all of our own electrical. And it started in 2006. We got our experimental distilling license. There was no state laws in the state of Nevada. And so we could basically make it, age it, experiment with it. You know, we just couldn't let people taste it. We couldn't sell it or do anything because there's no commercial laws in Nevada. And so we finally got laws passed in 2013. So it's kind of a blessing in disguise because from 2006 to 2013, we played around with different mash bills. We played around with different grain varieties. I mean, there's hundreds of grain varieties of each type of grain. There's different types of grain like soft white winter wheat, hard red, soft red. There's so many varieties and varieties of corn and everything else. And so we played around with different varieties, different mash bills, different irrigation techniques, different fertilizer management, on the field side, then different yeast varieties, different mash bills, everything. So that in 2013, when we got the laws passed, we knew exactly what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. So we designed the building ourselves, like I said. We did a lot of our construction part of it. We'd had a contractor help us with the building part. But it was kind of a blessing in disguise because we really understand the stills because we put it together ourselves. And let's go in here because I'll kind of explain this part. So the stills, what we learned from the beginning is I loved the stills for different reasons. Like continuous stills are so efficient. You can get so much quantity out of them. But I just didn't feel like you could get an adequate tails and the heads and the tails cuts, and so I really knew that I wanted a pot still because I felt like you can get better quality with it, but a continuous still because you can get more quantity. And so we designed the stills so that we were basically stripping out the alcohol from the continuous stills, and then we're redistilling it in the pot still where we can take the heads and the tails cuts, adequately. And so instead of putting 8 to 10% mash in the pot still, now we're putting 40 to 45% alcohol in the pot still, and we're getting a lot more per batch. The problems with pot stills is they're not very efficient because you got to fill it up. You got to wait for it to heat up. You have to collect the heads, the middle, the hearts and the tails cuts and all that kind of stuff. And so, by putting in more alcohol, we're getting both quantity and quality because we're able to take the heads, the tails cuts and everything while still getting a decent amount per 5 times more per batch in the pot still. So this is all designed by Vendome Copper and Brass. I'm sure you guys have all heard of Vendome. But what was cool about it is the first one that they kind of made where continuous stills and pot stills work in unison together. We were flying home one time from Las Vegas, and there's an article in some distilling magazine, and Ashley pulls it open, and it's the middle spread. It's a story on Vendome, how this is the most efficient setup for a medium-sized distillery because you can kind of do what you want. You can fine-tune your products that way. And so when Vendome built it, they literally built it in the factory, took 2 pictures, disassembled it, put it on a truck and sent it to us. There's no manuals. There's nothing, that you can do. So we literally had to put it together, looking at these 2 pictures, which was really like I was saying outside. It's a blessing in disguise because we really understand the whole system. We know what it looks like on the inside. We know how the principles of operation, which helps us to operate it better and more efficiently, and then also get a better quality product out of it at the end. We're making bourbon today, so you can see we have 2 continuous stills in the tail box on this side. So we told them we wanted every available option on it when we started. So there's a reflux onion right there. There's a deflegulator at the top. We used to have, we started off with a 500-gallon pot. This is a 1,000-gallon pot still, and 1 continuous still, and then a vodka column. And so we made vodka, gin, absinthe, other stuff for a while. But we always knew that we were a whiskey distillery. That other stuff kind of gave us something to do while the whiskey was aging, the 5 years.
I heard wonderful things about the gin last night, though.
Yeah. The gin is that's the one I'm most sad about not making anymore. And the absinthe was really good, too.
Would you ever bring it back?
No, I don't think so, because we're a whiskey distillery, and it was kind of we learned a lot with the gin and other products, on labeling and packaging and all that stuff, so that when we knew it really helped us to design our pack for the whiskey and everything else, and it really got us where we are today, but I don't want to do it anymore. Okay. So I do have 100 gallons in a tank over there that I'm kind of saving. So then this one was about a year ago in August. So we had, like I said, a 500-gallon pot still, and then there's a vodka column in the center. Last August, a year and a couple months ago. And when we did it, though, it was like the Cadillac Vendome still, because it had the vodka column, it had the reflux onion, the deflegulator. I told them I wanted every available option, and it was a funny story because at Vendome, there's a pipe that they put in from the back of the vodka column. We had no idea what this pipe did, so we call up Vendome hey, what's this deal? What's the deal with this pipe back here? And they're like, well, some guy, you said you wanted every available option. Some guy 5 years ago said that they wanted that added to their still. We don't know what it does either, but if you figure it out, let us know. But you said you wanted everything, so we went ahead and put it on yours too. I think it had something to do with a clean and play, a CIP system that honestly I don't think it should have been there anyways, but that's the only reasonable explanation for it. And so before that, when we were doing all of our experimentation, it was an evolution of 3 different stills that I made myself, before that. So we had a 2 20-gallon stills and a 50-gallon pot stills that we kind of made for our experimentation before we, got the laws passed.
Did you hang on to those experimental stills for posterity?
Yeah. So I got them there up on the attic of the
so they're not even on display anywhere?
No. They're not very pretty. They're kind of ugly. But someday.
So you went through all this last year and upgraded everything, right?
Yeah. So we added the second continuous still, put a 1,000-gallon pot still. This one over here is our original one that we've had from the beginning. Since I was a little boy, I always wanted to be a farmer. And so, for example, all of our alfalfa on the farm goes every year to China, Dubai, Japan, Taiwan. We're in this ideal growing area here. We're in the oasis of Nevada. You guys saw all the green that's around here, And so we know we can grow really high quality, but sending it across the world is kind of cool to think about, but you never get to see the final product. And so my wife and I were looking for ways that we could showcase the grains that we were growing. We knew that they were extremely high quality, but what can we do with them to showcase those? And my other love was always whiskey, and thought, like, what better way to showcase our grains and let other people experience it and, you know, be able to meet interesting people and everything else than to make it into whiskey. And so whiskey's kind of always been my passion, and it's kind of like the love of two different loves with agriculture and distilling and whiskey.
But your family had been farming here for generations, right?
Yeah. So my family actually bought this particular ranch in 1944, but we've been farming here in northern Nevada since 1854. And Nevada didn't become a state until 1864, 10 years after my family had already moved here. So they owned some of the first deeded property in Nevada. There's 8 people that were granted land at the same time as my grandpa, and those were the first 8 settlers in Nevada, and my great-great-grandfather was one of them. All of our water comes from the Truckee and the Carson Rivers, which originate on both sides of Lake Tahoe. And so the Truckee River actually comes from Lake Tahoe, and so we get all that water that comes through the rivers to a reservoir called Lahontan Reservoir. Lahontan Reservoir is operated by TCID, the Truckee Carson Irrigation District, and it's all gravity, and they get the water to us and supply it to us here on the farm. So it's really efficient. It's kind of cool because it's all gravity, whereas like a lot of farms use wells and a lot of electricity, and they consume a lot, where all of ours is all gravity from the beautiful, we call it Sierra snowmelt from the Sierra Mountains.
I'm curious about this because being in this oasis and working with the irrigation district, I know water issues in farming and agriculture have been an issue in this part of the country. How are you working with TCID, and how does it work with them to make sure you have the water you need?
Well, so we have water rights, and there's allocations every year. So like we're allotted 3.5 acre feet on our farm, and they do water measurements, and they'll allocate the water quantity that everybody gets based on how much snow we get in the mountains. And so this year was our first year in a while that we actually got cut back our water. So we were at 70%, which we were okay. At 70%, we can pretty much do everything we need to do on the farm. But the last few years we were at 100%, and some years even more, where they'll say there's too much water, and they'll let they give more water than we're even allocated because they need to get rid of it, otherwise we're going to flood, and so there's actually been a few of those scenarios in the last couple years also. So, but having the reservoir, we're really fortunate because we collect it, and then we can pull from the reservoir when we need it, not just whenever Mother Nature decides to let it run down the mountain, you know what I mean?
So how's this going to affect you long term? If you're down to 70% this year, what happens if you don't get heavy snowfall in the Sierra Nevadas this winter and you get cut back in future years?
Yeah, so right now we farm about 2,500 acres total. We lease some neighboring farms, but we only need about 500 acres of grain to produce what we're producing right now. This year we're going to produce close to 80,000 9-liter cases, and that we need about 500 acres to do that. And so we have extra. I mean, even if we had a really low water year, we'll sacrifice our other crops so that we can make sure that we can grow the wheat, rye, barley, and corn, on the farm here. Because that's our whole goal, is to grow 100% of our grains right here on the farm, so that we can't sacrifice that. So we'll sacrifice our alfalfa crops and our other crops to make sure that the corn, wheat, rye, and barley have plenty of water. There's a well here on the farm, and my grandpa put it in the 1950s, and that's what we use for the distillery. And so it's essentially gets recharged by the irrigation water. That's that beautiful Tahoe water. But it's really crystal clear, beautiful water. We're really fortunate to have it.
So you're taking the water from the reservoir and putting it into the well for storage, or what?
No, I'm just saying, we irrigate the crops. The well is literally in the middle of one of the fields. And so that the water that just flows down from the surface. So we surface irrigate it. That water filters through sand and down through and recharges our well naturally,
So production water, though, for the distillery, for your mashing and everything else, that's coming from the reservoir, right?
That's coming from the well, okay. Yeah.
So that's your sort of long-term hedge for this, to make sure that you can still have a distillery here 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah, and so and we continually recharge the well from the irrigation water, and so we're not worried about water there. It's more of for the field side of it if we ever had a drought or something like that. But we're fortunate we have extra irrigation land here, or extra land that we can sacrifice the water on some acres to make sure that the distillery always has water. So what's really cool about corn, you guys know how corn gets pollinated? You guys ever learned about that? Or
you have to do the thing with the tassels,
either birds or
right?
bees.
Yeah. So
it has a lot to do with the tassels.
Yeah. So the tassel at the top.
And tasseling corn.
That's when you want seed corn versus like your field corn. You detassel it to make it a certain. But for us, like the tassel drops pollen. The pollen comes down to the silk, which you guys have all probably had sweet corn, and you get that silky stuff out of it, Yep. Each one of those pieces of silk is connected to a kernel. So you can kind of see it right there. See that little white speck right there? Yep. That's where the pollen was connected to the kernel. Oh, wow. Now, every once in a while, you'll see a blank. Like, see that one right there? There's like a corn kind of missing right there. There should be one right there. Here's a good example right there. You'll see a blank. So what happened is there was some kind of a problem with the pollination coming from the tassel to that actual silk, because every one of these, it gets pollinated from the top of the corn. So that's why like you learn little things like from the family. Like when it's tasseling, you really want to make sure that it doesn't get too hot. So what we irrigate it more consistently, like closer together during that time. We learn things like when we first plant corn, we wait like 26 to 28 days from the first time we plant it till the next time we irrigate it. But every time after that, we got to irrigate it within like 10 to 14 days, depending on the weather and everything else. Because you want the roots after the first irrigation, those roots they start to go down and they get really vigorous and they're searching for water. Yeah. But after that, once the corn gets about knee high and up, it's determining how many kernels it's going to have. It's trying to figure out how much, like, it's saying, do I have enough water? Do I have enough fertilizer? Are the conditions right to make a big giant ear? And if they're not, it'll make a smaller ear, because its whole job in life is to reproduce, but it's not going to overproduce if it doesn't think it can handle it. So at that point, we want to make sure that the water's very, we don't stress it or anything like that, And then towards the end, we stop irrigating it and it dries down. The other cool thing about corn is, if you break it in half and you count the kernels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. They're always even. So it's crazy because there's always an even number of kernels around the ear of corn. So there's 16, 18, 20, 22. Yeah.
Now, when I pulled the husk back on this, I found that the kernels down here at the bottom of the husk towards the end of the corn are a lot moister than the top. Those at the top.
Yep. And so that's just because the husk was covering it right there. It's closer to the... so the corn stalk itself is basically like a big sponge. And so it's got a lot of moisture still in the stalk, but it's drying down right now. So it kind of starts at the end and it works its way up the actual ear.
So when will you harvest this?
Probably in 2 to 3 weeks. Yeah. So it's getting close, but it's still got some moisture. You can feel it. It's a little bit waxy. Still a little bit of moisture.
I mean, yeah, the husk feels really wet.
Yeah, so the husk feels wet, but how you can tell is it'll be really dry at the very end. But right here, it's got a little bit of moisture right there at the end of the kernel. This is just your traditional field corn. We played around with different varieties. Like, you would think that sweet corn, now we're looking for sugar in the distillery that gets converted into alcohol during fermentation, and you would think that a name like sweet corn would have a lot of sugar in it. But in reality, it's got more sugar in it, but the starch that's in corn has more convertible sugar in it because of the, starch is like a long sugar molecule. And then when sweet corn dries up, there's a lot of water in it, and it shrivels up. It looks almost like a raisin, sweet corn seed, And so there's and then there's other varieties like some distilleries use like Bloody Butchers and all those other like heirloom varieties. Mm-hmm. And my opinion on that is we tried them. They were finicky in the field. They were finicky in the distillery. They were hard to be consistent, from batch to batch and everything else. And there's a reason why they're heirloom. That you think the heirloom means better, but heirloom just means they're not grown anymore on a commercial basis. And it's because they were replaced with better stuff. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so I really feel like your normal standard dent corn. This is non-GMO, so it's not Roundup ready or anything like that. It's just a lot better for whiskey. This box right here, I just noticed it says Slayer, and it's a bee box, so those are all the bees. But there's a bee box that says Slayer, like the band.
Tell me about the bee boxes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of bees here on the farm. Really, bees don't help our crops a lot. Here, wheat, rye, barley, corn, alfalfa don't need bees. But bees are really important for the entire ecosystem and everything else. And they're really important for trees, especially in California when they pollinate all of the trees. So all these bees in the spring are in California. Then they bring them here basically to keep them alive. And so one of the things, they're not ours, but one of the things that they give us is they give us all the honey from them. So that's what we make all of our cocktails and everything with. They're right here from the farm. Because they're not interested in the honey. They're interested in just keeping them alive because they make a lot of money by charging farmers in California to pollinate all the trees, the almonds and the pistachios and all those trees in California.
The beekeepers, right?
Beekeepers, yeah. So there's alfalfa honey. All of our honey is really dark. If you guys look at it, it's a lot darker than your normal honey, and that's from alfalfa honey. But it's a lot more rich in nutrients, and it has a lot more like minerals and flavor to it, I think, than a lot of the really clear, like golden yellow honey that you get in the store.
One other thing. You know how some distillers experiment with sonic treatment of their maturing whiskey by playing music in the warehouses? Well, the Frey Ranch barrels get sonic treatment of a different kind. The ranch is just a few miles away from the U.S. Navy's Fallon Naval Air Station, which is the home of the Navy's Fighter Weapons School. You might know it better as Top Gun. Pilots have been known to buzz the distillery in their F-35 fighters at low altitude and high speed. Full disclosure, while I was at Frey Ranch as a guest of the distillery, full editorial control over the content of this segment remains with WhiskyCast. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Oban. Every sip of Oban is like a postcard from Scotland. Whether it's the classic Oban 14-year-old, the 18-year-old, Oban Little Bay, or the Distillers edition, every drop comes from the coastal town of Oban and a distillery just 206 steps away from the sea. It's one of Scotland's smallest distilleries, with just 7 people who make whiskey the same way their predecessors have since 1794. Find out more at obanwhiskey.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Baker's bourbon is usually matured for 7 years, but the Beam folks have started releasing some extra aged single barrels under the Baker's exclusive selection label. These barrels are 11 years and 8 months old, and they're bottled at 53.5% ABV. I received a sample of one recently. The nose has notes of caramel, toffee, oak tannins, and a hint of pipe tobacco. The taste is thick and spicy, with touches of cinnamon and black pepper, along with caramel candy, oak tannins, and a hint of baked apples. The finish is long and spicy, with touches of oak and caramel candy. I'm scoring the Baker's exclusive selection bourbon a 93. We met the folks from California's Redwood Empire Distillery last October in episode 905. Their Lost Monarch whiskey is a blend of straight bourbons and rye whiskeys, bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has touches of sandalwood, caramel apples, vanilla, and a soft oakiness. The taste has notes of apples, cinnamon, and white pepper, along with sweeter notes of honey, brown sugar, and vanilla. The finish is nice and long with a fruity tartness and lingering hints of spice. I'm scoring Redwood Empire's Lost Monarch blended whiskey a 92. More tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. They're reviving the tradition of Maryland-style rye at their Baltimore farm and waterfront distillery. In-person tastings are available once again at the distillery in Baltimore, but you'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. Visit sagamorespirit.com and please drink responsibly. Buchanan's Deluxe 12-year-old blended Scotch from Diageo is one of those whiskeys that has become popular in Latin and South America, along with other global markets. It's bottled at 40% ABV. The nose has notes of straw, dried grass, vanilla, honey, and a nice maltiness. The taste has a good balance of citrus fruits, soft oak, vanilla, honey, and a gentle smokiness that comes out slowly, but there is also a hint of bitterness to it. The finish is long with a gentle smokiness, and I'm scoring Buchanan's Deluxe an 89. And finally, let's look at the Legendary from Blackadder. This one is a 20-year-old single-barrel selection from an undisclosed distillery, bottled for Glass Revolution imports in the USA. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has a good maltiness with touches of butterscotch, toasted vanilla, caramel, and black tea with honey. The taste, fruity and tart with dried fruits, a gentle hint of spices, and touches of vanilla, honey, and butterscotch in the background. The finish is long and fruity with a touch of butterscotch, and I'm scoring the Legendary 20-year-old single malt Scotch a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 3,300 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Scarabus Isla Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. Thanks to Michael Barris for posting this note on our Facebook page the other day. I want to thank Mark for an education about whiskey. Over years of listening to your podcast and reading your posts, I have enjoyed learning about whiskey and developed a taste which often follows your suggestions. Although I envy your job, I want to thank you for all the time you spend working hard to teach us all about whiskey and drinking a few drams to help me decide which bottles to take home and share with friends. Thanks for everything, and I look forward to many years of future podcasts. Michael, I really appreciate you and all of our listeners. I'm looking forward to many more years of podcasting, too. Now, I posted the news the other day on social media about those talks aimed at ending the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum that would lead to the end of the UK's tariff on American whiskeys. Zach Spears tweeted this reply, "Good news, but if the tariff really does disappear, do we think manufacturers and distributors will lower the prices they have been forced to sell at, or do they keep the difference as profit?" Well, remember, retailers are not actually forced to raise their prices by the 25% cost of the tariff. That tariff is a tax the importer of American whiskeys pays in the UK at the time they take delivery when a shipment clears customs, and it can become part of the importer's pricing structure downstream. It worked the same way when the U.S. had its tariff on single malt whiskeys from Scotland and Northern Ireland a while back, until a tentative deal on aircraft subsidies helped get rid of that tariff for a while. Now, that said, Zach, when do whiskey prices ever actually go down? Finally, I mentioned on social media a few weeks ago that I have been looking for a used whiskey thief, also known as a Valinch. It's one of those long copper tubes that distillers and blenders use to pull samples from a barrel. Getting ready to do some remodeling here in my home office and studio, and I have always wanted to have one as a display piece. Yeah, I could go out and buy a new one, but I want one that has some history to it, some dents, some tarnish, a patina to it, a story to it as well. So I'd like to send a special shout out and thanks to Gary Mills and his friends and colleagues at Glen Scotia and Loch Lomond Distillers. He responded that they have a retired thief that was used at both Glen Scotia and Loch Lomond, and they're going to send it to me. I did offer to pay for it, but he said to consider it a late Christmas present. Thank you, Gary. We'll give it a good home. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskyCast, or just email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Scarabus, the Islay single malt from Hunter Lang & Company that celebrates all of Islay's natural gifts in one bottle. Only those who seek shall find Scarabus. Start your search at hunterlang.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. We're going to have some fun with an occasional feature in this segment, since one of the questions I'm most often asked is how to get a job in the whiskey industry. So one of those things I've been asking people in our interviews over the last few months is how they got their start, and we're going to share those stories from time to time. There are plenty of different ways to get that first gig. For instance, longtime Diageo brand ambassador Ewan Gunn did not start out as a brand ambassador.
My first gig was at university. I actually got a role working with Cadenheads, looking after, it was a commercial role, looking after their global sales. And did that for a few years. Also got the chance right at the start to work in Springbank Distillery, sort of making whiskey, which was amazing. Still use that knowledge to this day, actually. Worked at Angus Dundee Distillers for a while, looking after Europe and the Middle East, and then moved into brand ambassador roles with Dealers, actually, in the US, where I first met you. That was about 18 years ago now. And then on their global team, and then I moved to Diageo about just over 10 years ago, and haven't looked back. Yeah.
We'll be sharing more of those How I Got That First Job stories in the coming months. And if there's something else you'd like to see us look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a rare style of Irish whiskey with a creative twist. A unique triple-distilled blend of single pot still and single malt premium Irish whiskies. Writer's Tears Copperpot. Do you dare to be creative?
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, the calendar of events, my tasting notes, the whiskey photo of the week, cocktail recipes, and a lot more, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com.
Just like the end of this WhiskyCast episode, Dewar's Double Double always makes for a smooth finish. Keep an eye out for a bottle of Double Double 21 year, and here's to a very happy new year.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2022, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.